On October 24, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea stretched out beneath a flawless canopy of tropical sky, its surface glimmering with fractured light as the swells rolled lazily, catching the sun in flashes like shards of glass. From the distant shorelines of the Philippine Islands, it all seemed deceptively tranquil, the kind of seascape that invited wonder rather than fear. Yet beneath those calm waters, something vast and unrelenting was advancing with single-minded purpose. It was Musashi, the Imperial Japanese Navy's second Yamato-class battleship, a moving fortress of steel armed with the most colossal naval guns ever placed upon a warship. To the Japanese, she was not simply a vessel of war, but the embodiment of their nation's faith in one crushing blow, a titan built to alter the fate of empires. Aboard her, nearly 2,500 sailors and officers stood at their posts, the humid air clinging heavily to their uniforms as if pressing down on them with the weight of destiny itself. They were the human core of Vice Admiral Takeo, Kurita's Central Strike Force, a formation designed as the centerpiece of a desperate attempt to halt the American advance into Leyte Gulf. The plan was ambitious and perilous in equal measure. Cut through the American screen, find the vulnerable transport ships laden with supplies and reinforcements for MacArthur's invading army, and annihilate them before they could fuel the land campaign. Success could reshape the trajectory of the entire war, but failure would leave Japan exposed, its final hope evaporating into the sea. Yet for all her size, firepower, and reputation, Musashi pushed forward under an endless dome of blue without a single friendly aircraft above to shield her, exposed to the inevitable. Assault everyone on board could feel drawing nearer. The warning came not first by sight but by sound, a low vibration on the wind, faint at first, so steady it could have been mistaken for the rustle of distant weather. But the sound grew, deepening into a persistent hum that seemed to sink into the very bones of the men who heard it. Soon, eyes strained eastward and caught sight of specks, barely perceptible at first, then multiplying in rapid succession, swelling into dozens and then hundreds until the sky itself seemed to darken with them. These were the carrier planes of Task Force 38, the most formidable naval air power ever assembled, sweeping in formation toward a single, massive target, the largest warship the world had ever seen. Orders were barked across Musashi's steel decks, sailors running to their stations as the forest of anti-aircraft weapons, over 130 barrels in all, swiveled toward the heavens. Her monstrous 18.1-inch main guns, designed to hurl shells heavier than automobiles across miles of ocean, were nearly worthless against the darting swarms of aircraft above. This was not to be the old battle of broadside against broadside. This was a clash of epochs, an armored giant of the dreadnought age standing against the unrelenting reach of modern air power. In only a few hours, the crystalline waters would be shattered by thunderous detonations as bombs, torpedoes, and fire rained down upon Musashi, and even her armor, thicker than any ever forged, would be tested to the breaking point. But to grasp why such a titan was ever built and why Japan had placed so much faith in her, one must turn back to the ideas that shaped her creation decades earlier. In the opening years of the 20th century, the Imperial Japanese Navy embraced a single doctrine, a belief so powerful it influenced every warship they designed and every plan they drew. This doctrine was known as Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Its roots lay in 1905, when in the waters of the Tsushima Strait, a smaller Japanese fleet met and obliterated the Russian Baltic Fleet, a force that had sailed halfway across the globe. The victory was instantaneous, shocking, and absolute, and it left Japanese strategists convinced that the surest path to triumph lay in luring a stronger enemy across the ocean, wearing them down with attrition, and then destroying them utterly, in one climactic clash. For Japan, the inevitable enemy of the future was clear. The United States, whose industrial might could outproduce Japan many times over. The strategy was straightforward in theory. Allow the Americans to cross the Pacific, while being harassed by submarines and land-based aircraft, then strike them near Japan's home waters with the combined fleet and annihilate them in one decisive afternoon. This belief dictated everything. Knowing they would always be outnumbered, Japan chose not to build many ships, but instead a few that would be unmatched in size and power. By the 1930s, as tensions mounted and conflict seemed unavoidable, this philosophy reached its peak. Japan resolved to create battleships so vast and so heavily armed that no single enemy ship could possibly stand against them. These warships would serve as the ultimate trump cards in the decisive battle. The culmination of this thinking was the Yamato class, two behemoths unlike anything afloat. Musashi, the second of the pair, mounted 9 of the largest naval guns ever made, each 18.1 inches across and capable of firing shells the size of small vehicles over immense distances. Her armor was so thick that designers believed no weapon on Earth could pierce it. To her builders, she was untouchable. Yet hidden within this dream was a flaw. The assumption that the next war at sea would look like Tsushima, ship against ship and gun against gun. The world, however, was already moving beyond that vision, as aircraft began to reshape the very nature of naval combat. When the decision was made to build her, secrecy was essential. The Washington and London treaties had once capped Battleship, size at 35,000 tons, but Japan had abandoned those agreements, and Musashi would exceed 70,000 tons at full load, an open defiance of international law. Her construction began on March 29, 1938, at Mitsubishi's shipyard in Nagasaki, under the shroud of concealment. The slipway was covered by a massive wooden structure draped with thick hemp ropes, making it appear from above like a simple warehouse. Within this hidden space, thousands of workers toiled endlessly, crafting a warship that challenged the very limits of engineering. Each gun barrel weighed as much as an entire destroyer from earlier decades, demanding specialized facilities just to forge them, and intricate planning to transport and mount them. Her turrets were clad in armor over 2 feet thick, and beneath, her waterline, torpedo bulges, and compartmentalized spaces were designed to contain flooding. Her bow, bulbous and innovative for its time, allowed her massive bulk to cut more efficiently through the sea, giving her a surprising top speed of 27 knots despite her displacement. She was so enormous inside that passageways required directional, arrows painted on the walls to prevent crew from losing their way. She was, in every sense, a floating city. Her launch could not be made into a spectacle. On November 1st, 1940, Nagasaki was ordered into a citywide air raid drill, forcing residents into shelters while Musashi's hull slid into the sea. The wave she created was so immense that it flooded nearby streets, an unintended show of her sheer size. When commissioned in August 1942, Musashi was more than steel and guns. She was a symbol of Japanese pride, technological achievement, and unshakable belief in the decisive battle. To her crew, she was unsinkable, and perhaps they truly believed it. Yet the age of the battleship was already slipping away, replaced by the dominance of the skies. When Musashi joined the fleet in 1942, she immediately replaced Yamato as the flagship of the combined fleet. Her arrival at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands was like the entrance of royalty. Truk, often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was a fortress of coral, with airfields, fuel depots, and repair yards spread across its vast natural harbor. Against this backdrop, Musashi loomed like a floating city, dwarfing the cruisers and destroyers clustered around her. Her colossal turrets rose skyward like ancient monuments, symbols of an age already fading. From her bridge, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded the fleet until his death in 1943, after which Admiral Minechi Koga took his place. From Musashi's command decks, orders radiated across thousands of miles of ocean. Her crew drilled relentlessly, convinced they were destined for a grand confrontation. Gunners practiced until their movements became mechanical, engineers kept her machinery ready at all hours, and lookouts scoured the horizon with expectation. Everyone aboard believed the moment would come when Musashi would carve her name into history. But that moment never came. The war in the Pacific was not fought in the way Japan had imagined. It unfolded in jungles, in skies above distant islands, and in the depths beneath the waves. Aircraft carriers had risen as the true rulers of the sea, rendering Musashi's colossal guns increasingly irrelevant. Time and again, in 1943, she sailed, with powerful task forces, racing to intercept American carriers, only for the enemy to vanish before engagement. Each time she returned to Truk Lagoon without ever firing her main batteries in combat. The men began to joke that they served aboard the Yamato Hotel, a nickname born of both pride and frustration. For compared to the cramped, stifling quarters of smaller warships, Musashi's accommodations seemed luxurious. She even offered air conditioning in some command spaces, an unheard-of comfort at sea. Yet for all her luxury, she had no purpose. For a warship built to fight, endless waiting was a torment, and as 1944 dawned, the tide of war was shifting, and Japan's dream of decisive battle was slipping away. American forces were advancing, step by step across the Pacific, tightening their grip on Japan's defenses with each island they seized. For Musashi, the first true test of battle would not come from an exchange of broadsides with another mighty battleship, but from an unseen adversary lurking beneath the surface. On the night of March 29, 1944, as darkness settled over the Pacific, Musashi cut through the waters near the Palau Islands, her enormous hull gliding under the silver wash of moonlight. She had just completed an unusual task for a vessel of her class, transporting troops to reinforce a distant garrison, and her escort was thinner than usual, a gamble that soon invited danger. Beneath the surface prowled the USS Tunney, an American submarine commanded by Lieutenant Commander James A. Scott. In the dim glow of Tunney's sonar room, operators picked up the deep, steady beat of massive propellers, the kind only a giant warship could produce. Scott raised the submarine to periscope depth, and through the eerie green lens appeared the unmistakable outline of a Yamato-class battleship, her towering bulk dominating the horizon. Few Allied submariners ever glimpsed such a sight and lived to tell of it. Scott knew he could not hope to sink such a monster with the torpedoes he carried, but even a wound would be a victory, a reminder that she was not untouchable. Tunney crept into position and loosed 6 torpedoes in a deadly spread. On Musashi's bridge, sharp-eyed lookouts spotted glowing tracks slicing through the sea and shouted warnings. The helm responded instantly, engines surging as the great ship heaved into a hard turn. Most of the torpedoes streaked harmlessly past her bow and stern, but one struck home. The detonation thundered through the night as a column of water and twisted metal blasted skyward, drenching the forward decks. The shock reverberated the full length of the ship, knocking men off balance and rattling her steel frame. Below, seawater surged into the ruptured compartments, flooding through an 18-foot gash in the hull. Nearly 3,000 tons poured in, pulling her bow lower and causing a subtle list to port. Yet Musashi remained far from crippled. The impact had missed her armored citadel, leaving her engines, magazines, and vital systems intact. She kept her speed, her massive guns ready for use, while below decks her crew fought furiously to stem the flooding, sealing compartments and pumping water back out. Hours later, battered but unbowed, Musashi turned back toward Japan for repairs. The lesson, however, was unmistakable. The mightiest battleship afloat could be stalked and struck by an unseen enemy without ever glimpsing its attacker. At the Leyte Gulf naval arsenal, her wounds were patched and she was fitted with additional defenses. Dozens of new 25mm anti-aircraft guns sprouted from her decks, swelling her total to more than 130 barrels aimed skyward, a bristling hedge of fire meant to shield her from the aerial threat everyone knew was coming. Whether that would be enough remained an open question, one that would soon be answered in a battle unlike any the world had seen. By June 1944, Musashi steamed once more into combat, her decks bristling with new weapons, as part of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet tasked with contesting the American landings on the Mariana Islands. For Japan's naval leadership, this was the long-awaited chance for the decisive clash they had envisioned for decades. Musashi and her sister Yamato formed the backbone of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's surface strike group, intended to move in after Japan's carriers had weakened the American force. On paper, the plan was simple. Aircraft would soften the enemy, and the battleships would move in to finish them. In reality, the Japanese carrier force was a shadow of what it had been in 1941. Years of brutal attrition had decimated their experienced airmen, and their replacements were poorly trained and lacking combat seasoning. The planes themselves were increasingly outdated, unable to match the new generation of American fighters. Facing them was the full might of Task Force 58, a massive armada of fast carriers launching hundreds of aircraft crewed by veterans of countless victories. Their primary fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, was faster, tougher, and deadlier than almost anything Japan could field. American radar-guided control gave them yet another edge, allowing them to intercept incoming strikes long before they reached their targets. On June 19th, the two sides clashed in a battle that American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft surged forward in wave after wave, only to be shredded by swarms of Hellcats that cut them down with ruthless precision. By the time the fighting ended 2 days later, Japan had lost more than 600 aircraft and 3 carriers, losses that could never be replaced. Musashi never fired her great guns in anger. The battle unfolded far beyond her reach, decided in the skies while her anti-aircraft batteries spat fire at distant dots that never came close. She loomed on the edges of history, an enormous figure, with no role to play in the war that now turned on air power. The devastation left Japan's navy crippled. As one officer admitted bitterly afterward, Japan had no more air. Without carriers and their protective fighters, even the largest battleships were exposed to destruction from above. From that moment, Musashi would sail beneath hostile skies, her vast strength undermined by a vulnerability she could not overcome. By October 1944, Japan's leaders were cornered. American troops had landed in the Philippines, threatening to sever the empire's lifeline to the vital oil and raw materials of Southeast Asia. Without those supplies, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt. Desperation gave birth to a plan of staggering ambition, Operation Shogo, the victory operation, a final gamble that bordered on suicidal resolve. It called for a 3-pronged strike meant to lure, distract, and annihilate. Every remaining major warship would be committed, no matter the cost. To the north, Admiral Ozawa led what appeared to be a powerful carrier group, 4 flat tops carrying barely 100 aircraft flown by inexperienced aviators. Their mission was not to fight, but to serve as bait, to draw Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet away from the Philippines. If Halsey took the lure, the Southern and Central forces would close in for the kill. The Southern Group, a formation of older battleships and cruisers, would push through Surigao Strait to strike the American beachhead from below. But the true hammer lay with the Central Force under Vice Admiral Kurita, Japan's strongest fleet still afloat, boasting 5 battleships including Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, and a strong escort of destroyers. Their mission was to surge north from Borneo, push through the narrow San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the American transports at Leyte Gulf, annihilating them in a storm of fire. For Musashi, this was the long-awaited moment of destiny, the battle for which she had been conceived and built. After years of idling, of sorties without combat, she was finally bound for the decisive clash. Yet the plan relied on timing, deception, and the gamble that Halsey would be drawn away precisely as intended. Few aboard doubted the cost. Crews were given the Imperial rescript, its closing words leaving no ambiguity. They were expected to give everything, even their lives. On October 22, 1944, the Central Force departed Brunei Bay. The tropical sky was muted, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Aboard Musashi, the mood was somber and resolute. Sailors scribbled final letters they knew would never be delivered, polished their equipment in silence, or simply sat lost in their own thoughts. Everyone understood this was not another fruitless sortie. This was the mission that might end them all. At dawn on October 23rd, as the fleet moved through the Palawan Passage, unseen danger awaited. Two American submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace, had positioned themselves perfectly. Their crews could scarcely believe their luck when the silhouettes of Kurita's massive fleet emerged. The attack came suddenly and with devastating precision. Torpedoes ripped into Otago, Kurita's flagship, sending her plunging beneath the waves within minutes. Another cruiser, Maya, was torn apart and sank quickly. A third, Takao, was left crippled and forced to retreat. Amid the chaos, Kurita himself was thrown into the oil-slicked sea, clinging to wreckage until a destroyer hauled him out. He transferred his command to Yamato, but the damage to both the fleet's strength and its morale was severe, and the cost of pressing forward into the jaws of battle was already clear. The operation pressed forward regardless of the danger. By the morning of October 24th, the Central Fleet had pushed into the Sibuyan Sea. The surface was calm, the skies were clear, and the conditions could not have been better for aircraft. What seemed like good fortune was in truth disastrous, because such clarity made them easy to find. At 8 o'clock, spotters on Musashi reported American reconnaissance planes circling above. PB-4Y privateers gliding like hunters biding their time. The alarm was raised, and the order for battle stations echoed through the ship. Sailors sprinted to their posts, and gun crews aligned their weapons to blanket the heavens in fire. Everyone understood the reality. Once their position was confirmed, carriers would send their full force. It was only a matter of when, not if. They were still several hours from the relative safety of the San Bernardino Strait, exposed in open water with no protective aircraft of their own. For Musashi, this was the test her builders had envisioned. Her immense anti-aircraft arsenal, thick layers of armor, and well-practiced damage control crews would now be pushed to their limits. The enemy was coming with overwhelming power, and all of that strength would inevitably be directed at the largest target afloat. At 10:26, the calm horizon shattered as tiny black dots materialized in the eastern sky, growing rapidly into tight formations of American carrier planes diving toward their prey. Orders on the bridge flew back and forth, engines thundered to full power, and the sea foamed behind the battleship's massive stern. Over 100 anti-aircraft weapons of every caliber swung skyward in unison. The ship's warning horn thundered across the decks as the first explosions ripped through the air. Bursts of black smoke filled the sky, tracers streaked upward, and even the giant 18-inch main guns were turned into air defense, firing shells designed to explode mid-air and shower fragments across wide arcs. Yet the attackers pressed relentlessly on. From above, hell divers plunged in near vertical dives, their bombs screaming down onto the battleship, while Avenger torpedo bombers swept low over the waves, spreading into coordinated patterns to strike from multiple sides. On the bridge, frantic commands ordered sharp maneuvers to spoil the aim of torpedo bombers without making it easier for dive bombers overhead. Musashi, enormous and heavy, responded too slowly. A bomb smashed into her forward turret, crippling its elevation mechanism. Another pierced the upper deck, igniting fires. Soon after, torpedoes struck with sickening force, detonating deep into her hull. Compartments near the engines filled with seawater, the ship tilting to starboard until counter-flooding teams raced to stabilize her. In less than 20 minutes, the first wave was over. Musashi still moved forward, guns blazing, but she bore the wounds of battle. Smoke drifted across her decks, and stretcher-bearers carried the fallen. The crew knew the ordeal had barely begun. The enemy had fixed her. Location and more attacks would follow. The largest warship ever built had endured the first strike, but the day stretched long ahead. The Americans returned with methodical precision. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, grasped the magnitude of the threat. If this Japanese force broke through toward Leyte, the consequences could be devastating. He gave his carriers a direct order: strike the central force without pause until it was destroyed. From carriers such as Intrepid, Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Enterprise, wave after wave of aircraft lifted off. By nightfall, 259 planes would be hurled at one target, the massive flagship Musashi. This was not chaotic aggression, but a refined demonstration of American carrier warfare. Each group was carefully composed of Hellcats to strafe and suppress gunners, Helldivers to hammer vital structures, and Avengers to unleash torpedoes in coordinated patterns. The fighters swept in first, shredding exposed gun crews and sowing confusion. For men at open mounts, the experience was horrific, staring down the muzzles of enemy fighters with only thin steel shields for protection. Then the dive bombers plunged, their explosives slamming into the bridge, turrets, and decks designed to resist even the heaviest bombardments. Almost simultaneously, torpedo planes approached from both flanks, forcing the giant ship into an impossible dilemma. Turn one way to avoid, and the other side was left wide open. Below decks, crews braced for the impacts they knew were unavoidable. Alternating hits threatened to unbalance their desperate counterflooding, risking capsizing. Each strike lasted only minutes, but the mental strain was crushing. The horizon never cleared. Always, more aircraft loomed in the distance. Above the chaos of gunfire and explosions, the drone of engines became a constant drumbeat of dread. Musashi forced herself toward the San Bernardino Strait, but every moment tested her armor and the resilience of her crew as no battleship had ever been tested before. More waves approached, each heavier than the last. By noon, the second and third waves descended with brutal accuracy. Helldivers rained bombs that rattled the entire frame of the ship, while Avengers skimmed low across the sea, sending torpedoes, crashing into her sides. Port and starboard were struck in sequence, tearing open fresh wounds. The violence twisted bulkheads and left compartments in darkness as men fought to stem the flooding. Pumps strained, sailors waded through oil-slicked water, and compartments were deliberately flooded to counter the growing list. Yet every adjustment was undone by fresh strikes. Musashi's speed dropped steadily. 27 knots reduced to 22, then 18, and still falling as power was lost. The rest of the fleet surged ahead under orders, leaving Musashi to trail further behind, her escorts struggling to protect her. The air roared with engines and gunfire. Towering splashes erupted around her, and bombs smashed into her decks with horrifying effect. Crews were torn apart at their stations, shrapnel ripped across the upper decks, and yet survivors kept fighting, stepping over the fallen to continue manning their weapons. Engineers coaxed what power remained from damaged machinery. The once proud symbol of Japanese naval strength now reeled under blow after blow, yet refused to sink. By early afternoon, American pilots described the battleship as engulfed in smoke, spewing fire yet still returning a storm of flak. By 1:30, Musashi was badly listing, her bow almost awash, her progress slowing to nothing. Alone, crippled and isolated, she waited for the next strike, the one meant not to weaken, but to finish her. By mid-afternoon, she bore more than a dozen wounds, her armored hull scarred and twisted, her tilt worsening with every passing minute. Smoke drifted from her shattered gun batteries, and the mighty ship's struggle was far from over. Though she still floated, the Americans could not accept it. To the returning pilots, the damaged behemoth trailing behind the Japanese fleet was nothing less than a challenge demanding a final strike. Word of her condition reached Admiral Halsey, and his response left no room for doubt. Destroy her completely. The 5th and 6th waves were sent with a single objective, to push the world's largest battleship beneath the waves. The torpedo bombers arrived first, circling with patience like predators closing in on weakened prey. Their target was nearly motionless, and they aimed precisely at her unbroken sections along the starboard side, intent on worsening her tilt until the force of gravity would roll her over. One torpedo after another smashed into her hull, each explosion shaking her from keel to deck. The ship groaned as though alive, her steel plating shuddering under the strain. Above, bombers screamed down upon her, striking the area around her, smokestack and stern in hopes of disabling her rudder and engines. Her anti-air defenses faltered. Many gunners had already been killed, their stations reduced to wreckage, while the few survivors clung to their duty through exhaustion, deafened and blinded by endless hours of smoke, cordite, and fire. Ammunition runners stumbled through passageways, slick with blood, carrying shells to weapons that were silenced moments later by fresh hits. By mid-afternoon, the assault ended, leaving the battered giant drifting and broken. She had endured an almost inconceivable barrage, 19 torpedo hits, 17 direct bomb strikes, and countless near misses, more than any ship had ever suffered while still afloat. Yet her survival was only an illusion. Her bow was buried. Flooding spread unchecked through compartment after compartment. Fires smoldered deep within her, and the pumps failed to stem the deluge. Around her lay wreckage, twisted steel, shattered guns, and splintered boats, while the stench of oil and explosives filled the air. Her crew understood the truth. The battle was finished. The question was no longer whether she could fight, but how long she would resist the sea. Soon the order would come to abandon her, and for over 1,000 men, the ocean would be their grave. By dusk, the end was near. Flooding reached the magazines, threatening explosions that could rip her apart. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Inoguchi assessed the situation with calm finality. The ship could not be saved. His final order was issued. Attempt to ground her on the shores of Sibuyan Island to preserve what could be saved. In the bowels of the ship, engineers coaxed her battered machinery into life one last time, and she inched forward at barely 6 knots. For a fleeting moment, hope returned, but it was quickly extinguished as pumps failed again. Compartments collapsed to flooding, and her movement ceased. Dead in the water, her tilt deepened. 16 degrees, then 20, her portside batteries sinking below the waves, her bow plunging as her stern rose. Inoguchi, unmoved by the pleas of his men, withdrew to his quarters, resolved to perish with his ship. At 7:15 in the evening, with the vessel sinking fast, the order was given to abandon her. The crew obeyed with grim composure. The wounded were lowered with improvised stretchers. Others climbed down into the oil-dark water or reached for rafts. Nearby destroyers risked themselves to pull survivors aboard, casting lines and dragging aboard men slick with oil and shivering in exhaustion. On the tilting decks, those still aboard gave their final salute, raising their voices in 3 cheers for the Emperor before slipping into the sea as their ship moaned around them. But for over 1,000 sailors, trapped below or too gravely, wounded to move, no escape was possible. The giant was about to take them with her. Night fell as her final moments arrived. Her tilt worsened, 20 degrees, 30 past 60, as water swallowed her guns and waves broke over her upper works. Survivors watched silently as she groaned and cracked, steel buckling and tearing apart, boilers exploding in bursts of steam that rose in ghostly plumes. Slowly, she rolled onto her side, her immense red hull exposed to the fading light. For a moment, she seemed suspended in time, a mountain of steel turned on its flank, but gravity claimed her. The bow dipped, dragging the rest of her down as the stern rose toward the sky, her 3 colossal propellers gleaming for the final time. Like a monument to her own passing, she hung there, then slipped backward with a thunderous roar into the abyss. Water swallowed her stern, explosions of air and debris erupting as she vanished. At 7:36 p.m. on October 24, 1944, she was gone, carrying with her 1,023 men, including Admiral Inoguchi, who kept his vow to remain aboard. Where once she had towered, only an oil-blackened patch of sea and scattered wreckage remained. Survivors clung to debris, rafts, and one another under a sky filled with indifferent stars, the taste of oil heavy in their mouths. In the distance, the battle still raged, but here only the quiet rhythm of the waves remained. Her sinking was more than the end of a warship. It marked the death of an idea, the closing of the battleship era. She had been conceived as the ultimate weapon, a floating fortress no surface fleet could challenge, yet she was undone not by another Leviathan, but by relentless swarms of aircraft, each worth a fraction of her cost. Her loss declared to the world that the age of the battleship was finished, and the future belonged to carriers. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic. For the operation she had died defending failed, leaving the Navy shattered and incapable of striking again. For decades, her grave remained unknown, her memory preserved only by those who survived and in fading photographs. Then, in 2015, her wreck was discovered over a kilometer beneath the Sibuyan Sea by a research vessel led by Paul Allen. Cameras revealed her broken bow, shattered turrets, and twisted structure, a haunting reminder of her violent end. Resting silent in the deep, she is more than a relic. She is a memorial to the men who served her and a warning of how swiftly new technologies can render the mightiest weapons obsolete. The very faith that built her ensured her doom, a truth that echoes through time. For every era forges its own symbols of invincibility,